Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Duncan Toplis 2024 Kreston Academy Marketing Review. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Hopefully you can see the slides there. So just starting off with what we're going to talk to you about today. So what I want to drop is what reserves on planning for the future. The current trend regards to learning and growing mathematisation saying that that benefits of learning math. And costs where we've been the most pressures have been quite a lot this year. And is there anything that can be done to mitigate continuous increases? And the balance sheet and why that is important. We're starting off now with regards to trust reserves and planning for the future. So we have actually talked a lot from our clients this year about reserves. The main reason for this is that on the 14th of November, the ESFA issued some guidance around trust reserve levels. They haven't set any of these actual reserve levels, but they do have what they consider high levels and low levels reserve. The high levels are those reserves that exceed 20% of total income, and low levels reserves are those that are down to 20% of income less. But the ESFA are saying that they are not looking for fraudulent reserves, but they do expect that trusts to have a clear plan of how those are going to be utilised to meet these needs in line with it and with the Academies principles of requirement. So it's no surprise that in light of this, we have actually seen quite a few trusts now designating funds. In fact, we saw 6% of revenue reserves being designated this year. We have some quite surprising feedback on our survey with regards to reserves. We did expect on what we were seeing last year that this year was going to be really tough with the rate of inflation, life and heat costs and all the stuff rate issues. However, what we did learn was that 48.8% of trusts that responded to our survey said that they're free.
So just going back then to what we're talking about with regards to our survey. So we were thinking it's going to be particularly tough, but 48.8% of trusts said that, respond to our survey said that their free reserves were more than their stated policy. 33.7% were on track and only 17.5% were below. So that actually means that 82.5% of our trusts held sufficient reserves for their needs at the year end. So there is some very positive work that has gone on in our trust to manage reserves carefully in these turbulent times that we've had. However, this could also be a sign of the caution that is being exercised by our trusts in light of the situation that we've been in. So looking at data we gathered, it was only the primary SATs that saw average deficits in the current year, with secondary SATs and all sizes of MATs returning a surplus and therefore adding to their reserves. These surpluses were significantly less than we saw last year, though. In fact, they were all between 83 and 95% less than in the previous year. We can't forget, though, that there were a couple of unexpected grants that supported this positive outcome. And if you see here that we're looking at average surpluses of just 6,000 and 9,000. So, you know, without those additional grants, there'd be a lot more trusts that were showing deficits. Amongst our clients, we are seeing primary SATs who have never considered joining a MAT now coming to realisation that this may need to be an option due to their reduced reserves. We're seeing some schools form key relationships with their local secondary schools and also beginning to have conversations and share knowledge in advance of having to seriously consider joining a MAT. This is helping some of them to test the water and also to look at matching their ethos with those schools that they're looking to join with. So returning now to designating reserves. When trusts have high levels of reserves, they need to be clear about their plans for these reserves. And when I've spoken to trusts at the year end, when we've been doing their meetings and AGMs, they have generally been able to tell me what their plans are and including those plans within their trustees' report in their financial statement. So the fact that trusts are wanting to designate reserves is very much because they are looking at reducing the likelihood of further scrutiny from the SFA. On top of this, designating funds also helps to concentrate the board's minds on future plans for reserves and to ensure that thought has gone into what purpose those funds are being held for. Another question we asked in our survey was based on the 3-year budgets and what would happen to revenue reserves over that time. And over 75% of responders said that they would be either lower or have entirely run out. So this isn't an unusual prediction. We get this most years. And as a group, at the Kreston group, we have been pondering this and whether it's because trusts are generally pessimistic about their future or whether we really are getting to the point now where trusts are just not going to be able to function financially. The problem is that funding is very difficult to forecast. We only need to look back at this year when there was so much uncertainty over teachers' pay rises and how much of that was going to be funded. So it's hardly surprising that trusts are hanging on to reserves or predicting running out of money when they cannot be certain how much the largest cost, which is staff pay, is going to increase by, or how much of that the government's actually going to fund, or what they'll need to find themselves. We need to remember that a lot of trust reserves policy is just 1 month's worth of income. And is that really enough in such turbulent times? I would suggest that trusts should think carefully about their reserves policy and how quickly they can adapt to any shocks or changes in the economy. So moving now onto the current trend with regards to joining and growing MATs and what our data says about the benefits. To start off with, I think it's important to explain our definition of a small, medium and large size MAT. So a small MAT is fewer than 3,000 pupils, a medium one is between 3,000 and 7,500 pupils, and a large MAT has over 7,500 pupils. So what are we seeing in the current trends? Although the school bill was dropped, we are still seeing a push for schools to join strong MATs. And our data shows that this is happening as the number of schools joining MATs this year has increased again. In 2023, the rise was at 5.4% against 2.7% in the previous year. Although over the last 5 years, we have seen very little change in the actual number of trusts. When we asked our trusts about growth in our survey, the number of MATs expecting to grow decreased from 92% last year to 73% this year. One thing we noticed when putting together our data, we found an anomaly whereby the data showed that primary SATs have had 2 consecutive years of deficits, but the average free reserves have increased, which just doesn't seem to make sense. What this is probably showing is that many primary SATs were absorbed into MATs as their position became financially unsustainable, which has just left the more financially robust primary SATs behind. It's highly likely that we'll see this trend continue with the primary SATs clearly struggling with falling reserves, increased costs and little opportunity to be able to make savings that a larger trust or a secondary academy can make, which is why we are seeing our single academy trusts that we've been talking to this year, talking to secondaries and MATs and realising that actually now is the time to make that move. As mentioned just now, our data also showed that the number of actual trusts has remained pretty static over the last 5 years, with only a net increase of 7 over that period, so from 1175 up to 1182. In the last year, we've actually seen a fall of 9 trusts, from 1191 to 1182 in our data. This could be where MATs have joined forces or converged into one trust, as well as trusts being dissolved and absorbed into stronger trusts. As an aside, one of the benefits of 2 smaller trusts joining together and forming a larger trust is that they may then benefit from an automatic grant of school condition and funding allocation each year, rather than having to apply for SIF funding, which can make planning for large capital projects a lot easier. We have also analysed centralisation again this year, and we've seen another significant move towards centralisation, with 60.5% of trusts fully centralised compared to 55.1% in the previous year. There are only 2.1 trusts that are fully decentralised. Progressing changes in finance software has also supported MATs to move to centralisation, and as auditors we have also put schools in contact with each other to share experience and knowledge of moving to a centralised structure. It would make sense that centralisation would be more beneficial financially as resources are brought together in one place, and our data appears to back this up. So what we're looking at is that fully centralised average free reserves per pupil are £742 compared to trusts where we've got a little bit of a combination of centralisation and decentralisation at £691. So that's £51 different. And then we've got a fully decentralised trusts have average free reserves of £434 per pupil. I mean, that's significantly less. Just one caveat on that though, we did only have 2 MATs in our data that were fully decentralised, so we do need to treat that figure with a little bit of caution. But we can't talk about centralisation without discussing pooling, as we do tend to see one follow the other to reap the greatest benefit from being part of a MAT. So we've had a lot of conversations this year with our clients about this, and it is now being discussed and considered by trustees quite widely. The number of trusts pooling income and or reserves has increased with 32% compared to 23% in the previous year. Our survey backed this up with 48% of the trusts coming back on the survey saying they're already pooling or are considering it. But what are the benefits of pooling? Well, the main benefit is that income and reserves can be moved to the area of most need within the trust to ensure the best outcomes for all pupils. It can also help with purchasing power and reduce administrative costs at local levels. In the current climate, it makes sense to pull resources together to have a strategy for the whole trust with all schools working together to make the best of the resources that they have. There's also the challenge of how to charge on the central costs from each of the individual schools, because they would need to contribute towards those. And it's difficult to keep up with the changes in prices when you're doing that recharge across. And we are finding that some of the central funds have gone into deficit, and trusts are then resolving that by moving to a pooling system. One of the things that we have considered could be the reason for the reduction in the number of trusts expecting to grow could be due to them looking to put their own house in order, so working on centralisation and pooling at the moment before committing to any further growth. And it's definitely easier to do that when you've got a smaller team rather than grow and have a big team to make those adjustments further down the line. So now moving on to costs, where we're seeing the most pressures, and is there anything that can be done to mitigate those continuing increases? So in our survey, the 2 top financial concerns of our trusts at present were staff costs, quickly followed by non-staff costs, and specifically light and heat. So it's hardly surprising that staff costs were the primary concern. Not only is this the largest cost of any trust, it is the one that has seen the most turmoil over the last year, with teacher pay disputes and uncertainty of how much the increases would be and how much of that would be funded. At first glance at our graphs, you could be forgiven in thinking that staff costs have not increased as expected. Average staff costs as a percentage of total costs have decreased across the board. But the reason for this is because other cost increases have outstripped the staff cost increases, in particular light and heat, which I will come on to a little later. If we look at the average teaching staff costs, they are a bit mixed. When we looked into this a bit deeper, this appears to be due to demographics, with more experienced teachers, those that are over age 50, leaving the profession. Teacher retention is a major issue, with many newly qualified teachers leaving the profession in the first 5 years, and the government has recognised this. And with this in mind, at this point, I just want to mention a couple of grants that do not appear to have been widely publicised. They are included on page 43 and 44 of our report. So if you want to have a look at the detail a bit more, you can look on those pages there. So there's a levelling up premium for eligible teachers in an eligible school teaching chemistry, computing, mathematics and physics. And those teachers that are eligible to make a claim for payments can claim between £1,500 to £3,000 for 23-24, and for 24-25 and 25-26 this actually goes up to £6,000. Now, this payment does actually have the tax and NI paid by the government, so this is a flat amount that they can receive. In addition to that, there is the early careers payments. Again, these are for maths, physics and chemistry teachers, not for computing, but it also includes foreign languages. And these are worth either £2,000 or £5,000, but can be as much as £3,000 or £7,500. And that just depends on where the trusts are. However, please note that teachers can only claim one of these two payments, so they should check eligibility and levels of payment just to make sure that if they are eligible to claim, they are claiming the most beneficial one. So I would encourage all trusts to have a look at these and just alert their newly qualified teachers to these possible claims that they can make. The pupil premium, the level up premium does need to be claimed by 31st of March 2024. Another key concern in relation to staff salaries is the teachers' pension scheme. From April 2024, the employer contribution rate does increase again by another 5% to 28.6%, with only the certainty of this being funded for the first year. So again, that needs some planning. Supply costs have also been a major concern for many of our clients. Our data showed that all sizes of mats have a similar average supply cost per pupil, but with increases across the board. Although larger mats have managed the increases better, with only a 9.7% increase compared to 16% increase for medium-sized mats. Although SATs have seen a fall in the average supply cost per pupil, this could be down to just cost pressures, whereby you can't actually spend what you haven't got, despite there actually being a need for additional resource. We did discuss this with our clients actually when we were doing our audits at the end of the year. And one of the other things they mentioned was that the increased costs, staff costs, were mitigated by difficulty recruiting. So there were quite a lot of open teaching positions that balanced out the increased costs. Obviously, this structure isn't sustainable in the long term. When we look at key management personnel costs per pupil, it is there that we start to see significant benefits of being within a larger trust. Yes, it's true that we might have head teachers included in average key management personnel costs for the smaller mats, and the larger trust could exclude these and only include CEOs, CFOs, HR directors, etc. But the gap is really significant, so there's actually no getting away from the fact that the average key management personnel cost per pupil is much lower, and this is where the most savings are to be made in the large trusts. Turning now to other costs, and the second top financial concern of our trust was light and heat. So this was a huge focus last year in our report, as many trusts were still within contract, and we were expecting to see the fallout this year and a bigger impact, and we definitely weren't wrong. The average heat and light cost per pupil increased by a minimum of 49% against the prior year. And yet again, it's the primary SATs that fared the worst, with an average increase of 56%. The average across all types of trust is pretty consistent, between 131 and 152. But if you take primary SATs, for example, in 2021, their average heat and light cost was £58 per pupil, and now it's £131 per pupil, and that's a whopping 125% increase over 2 years. In all, non-staffing costs increased by 16% per pupil. This will be down to not just heat and light costs, but also paper, food, repairs and maintenance, etc. The political turmoil both at home and abroad has been felt by our schools too, not just in our own pockets. So it's no wonder that those trusts that are already struggling are now realising that the road to survival lays with joining forces with other schools in a mat, and the cost savings due to centralisation and economies of scale that can be found there. So the balance sheet. We did tend to find in the past that trusts focus more on income and expenditure, and the balance sheet barely got a cursory glance. This may be due to the fact that trusts have previously not quite understood the importance of the balance sheet, or a lack of financial knowledge on trust boards meant that the balance sheet did not quite get the scrutiny that it deserves. But we're now seeing that the balance sheet is starting to be looked at a lot more closely, and this could be for several reasons. One reason being that as MATs grow, so does the professionalism in trusts and therefore the understanding of the balance sheet. We've also had the issues with RAC, which has shifted a lot of trust focus to the overall condition of their estates and pushed it up a notch or two on their risk registers. Another reason could be due to the changes in the Academy Trust Handbook over the last 5 years and the focus on the management account requirements included within that. So what should trusts be looking at with regards to the balance sheet? Well, I've already mentioned fixed assets. The June 2023 National Audit Office highlighted that around 700,000 pupils are learning in a school that needs major rebuilding or refurbishment. So trusts should ensure that they're putting in place short, medium and long-term plans for maintenance of their estate. As previously mentioned, large and some medium MATs should be able to benefit from receiving SCA funding to make this planning easier. The smaller trusts will have more uncertainty with regards to how to maintain their estates as they're competing for funding, which is getting more challenging all the time. But trust boards must ensure that they're aware of the condition of their estates to ensure they have the resources available for the most pressing maintenance needs, and to ensure that they have the funds to make the strongest SIF bids that they can, being able to plan to contribute as part of that bid. A small thing, but still important, trusts should also ensure they're keeping an eye on their debtors, making sure they're showing their detailed debtor list with their finance and audit committees as well. It's far too easy to overlook the detail of the debtor report and realise that debts have not been chased promptly, and then they become bad and it becomes too late. So turning now to cash, with the increase in the interest rates, any trusts that have a large cash balance that do not need to be utilised in the short term should look at how they can make that money work for them. So in our data, we actually had 269 trusts that had cash balances over £1 million, and there were 45 that had cash balances over 10 million. Obviously, you do need to take a great deal of care when you're looking at what you can do with those funds. You need to ensure that they're placed in a very safe place. But with the higher interest rates, you can actually make some financial gains. And if properly invested, there is the potential to add a further 40 or say 50,000 of income on each £1 million invested. That's what we're looking at with the current rates. Finally, I wanted to mention the local government pension scheme. When I talk to my trusts each year, it's always a really hot topic. Last year it was because the liabilities were so high. This year it's because we suddenly seem to be returning some assets. So it's always something that's wanting to be discussed in quite a bit of detail. Although trustees can't have an awful lot of effect on what those balances are, they should be aware of the local government pension scheme employer rate. So this is reviewed every 3 years, and the last change was effective from the 1st of April 2023. And as you can see from the table, there is an increase in the amount of trusts that are now paying more than 22.6% into the scheme, which is quite a significant cost. So those are the key points from the 2024 Kreston benchmarking report that I wanted to talk to you about today. There have been some positives. So, you know, if you're comparing what we were expecting last year, where we were expecting it to be a very difficult and challenging year, it's far from plain sailing, with costs continuing to rise and funding struggling to maintain pace. But the trusts seem to have managed fairly well across the board and have seemed to return surpluses and managing those reserves carefully. So, do we have any questions at all? So I don't currently seem to have any questions, but do just drop them down if you do have any at all. So I'd like to now hand over to Harry Gresham from Duncan Toplis IT Services, Datcom, who are part of the Duncan Toplis group.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rachel. Right, let me get my slides up. And we'll kick off. Can everyone hear and see me okay? Brilliant. Good morning, all. Just move the theme so you're not looking at yourself. There we go. So my name's Harry. I work for Datcom. We're part of the Duncan Toplis group. I'm one of the technical pre-sales consultants. So I work with clients to achieve their IT strategy goals in the education, commercial, and non-profit sectors. So really what we're going to cover this morning is a bit of a brief introduction to the state of cyber inside the education sector, some key risks, some mitigations, and where to turn to next, really. So starting with the bigger picture, really, there's been some really useful research done by the government over the last few years where they have surveyed academies on their stance to cyber, whether they've been attacked, and got some really useful results. This goes all the way from primary all the way to further and higher education, but I've put a bit more of a focus on the primary and secondary for this morning's webinar. So what we do know is that education are more likely to get hit than a business by a cyber incident, although attacks have plateaued in the year 22 to 23, where they continue to rise year on year in the commercial sector. This is despite the fact that board engagement in education establishments is greater when it comes to cyber than it is in the commercial space, looking at the results from this survey. What we do know and understand from the research taken is that as you move up through the age gaps of these establishments, the risk of attack and also the severity of attack rise as well. So 1 in 10 primary schools have experienced cybercrime in the 12 months to April 2023. That rises to 3 in 10 when we're looking at secondaries, and then as great as 6 in 10 when we look at further and higher education too. What we do know when it comes to higher and further education as well is the width of the attack and the methodology used is also wider, with things like denial of service and impersonation attacks being greater too. 6 in 10 of those reported attacks, the respondents have reported that they've either lost money or data, or have had compromised accounts used for nefarious activities. So it's quite a serious risk. So the question is really looking at the data and then asking questions about why the two don't tally up is why more breaches in education when the technical controls are greater than in business in general, and there's greater board involvement. So really what we think the link is that typically these education establishments might have a smaller budget than their counterparts in business, and potentially seen as easier picking by malicious actors. We suspect another link, the amount of sensitive data that education establishments are holding, not only on students but on faculty as well, and the ability to commit identity fraud and similar crimes like that en masse with these big data sets available to them. So some real life threats, really. We're going to look at a couple on this slide. The greatest one reported was phishing. So this is those blanket emails, you know, from almost mundane, you're so used to them nowadays, with things like Royal Mail or every you've missed a parcel, pay the late collection fee, to more higher value phishing emails from things like HMRC saying, you know, your tax bill is due. These have become more and more sophisticated over the years, and we've seen them become almost seasonal. So emails and texts in January and February time around late payment assessment, and emails and text messages around the Christmas time around missed deliveries, when people are more worried about getting deliveries in for Christmas. The results of these surveys show that when 87.3% of education establishments experienced phishing in the last 12 months conducted in the survey, compared to less than 80% in business. So they certainly are a target. Then going into a little bit more detail, so business email compromise is kind of under the umbrella of phishing. It's a much more sophisticated attack. 43% of respondents noted this as an attack vector in the survey. These are pre-planned attacks where they're picking out individuals that have typically got access to data or access to finances. They're targeting two things, really. They're targeting the ability to extract data, or both. So a few key mitigations, really. We know that every pound spent on cyber is a pound not spent on teaching and learning, so it really should be spent wisely. One area that should always be reviewed and reviewed regularly is security awareness training, also known as SAT. Humans, of course, are typically always going to be one of the weakest links in any organisation and their IT systems. So what we would recommend and always to consider is engaging testing and training for new and existing users on what to look for when it comes to things like phishing emails, and general training around IT security in a fun and informative manner. We would also recommend bundling this in at any new user induction too. So as soon as they're joining the organisation, they're getting that training and being brought up to speed on the rest. We'd recommend that the results of these campaigns are monitored over time, and more focus and attention should be put on users that are maybe consistently clicking phishing email links or entering passwords in these simulations. So they will be the ones that could go on and click a real link when it does come through, when we're not in a simulation. Our advice would be short, snappy and light-hearted resources have the biggest impact. You know, avoid those kind of 2-hour training sessions on IT security, because we don't think in general that you'll get engagement and staff buy-in. And really to monitor the results of these campaigns over time, see who's clicking the link, who's not, who is, and kind of put attention where you've got those users. Another area I thought it'd be good to cover is Microsoft 365. So it's a huge, well-established, mature platform now. Big uptake on it, and it's grown in seats massively, especially in the commercial and education sectors, with kind of the rise in remote learning over COVID. Schools and every type of organisation across the board have got a lot of growing reliance on the platform for storage of data with things like OneDrive and SharePoint, communication with things like Teams and Outlook Exchange, and applications as well. There's so many applications in the 365 ecosystem nowadays. So really, it's protecting those crown jewels. So many organizations are putting a lot of trust and a lot of data into 365, and it's making sure that work is being done to protect what's in there and stop anybody getting it that shouldn't have access to it. A couple of points to touch on here really are things like secure score. So there's a little screenshot in there. This is inside every portal and it gives you a customized score of what your tenant is. So typically in larger mats, you'll pool a 365 tenant to simplify licensing. So there could be thousands of seats inside here. And of course, that's thousands of records and potentially terabytes of sensitive data. So it's always well worth looking at a secure score and figuring out where work can be done and making sure that you're doing the necessary due diligence to mitigate an attack. One more thing on 365 security is the concept of managed detection and response and protecting the identities. So especially with key individuals in things like senior leadership teams and individuals in potentially payroll and HR as well that have got access to sensitive data, active monitoring of those accounts for things like suspicious logins or suspicious email rule creation. Malicious actors are getting access to a mailbox and then forwarding email off into siphoning off into different folders. And so the genuine user doesn't even know they've been breached and their email account is being used for nefarious activity. And just to touch on a couple more key mitigations really, although only 1 in 10 primary and secondary schools reported a ransomware attack in 22-23, I think it's well worth putting in this slide because the scale of disruption to teaching and learning is probably quite great compared to phishing, and the potential cost if someone decided to pay the ransom. Of course, our professional advice would be don't pay if you really don't have to. So typically backups have always been seen as the last line of defense against attacks like ransomware, and it's having backups in place and also ensuring that you're following best practices. It's all well and good having backups in place, or if the person that's changing them is offsite, for example, then the backup's only as good as the last time it was done. To touch on a couple of best practices, really, it's ensuring strategy has been put in place across the establishment to make sure that the right data is being protected, whether that's on premise or in the cloud, and kind of getting all the key decision makers involved in that process, ensuring they are running, of course, and can be restored from if need to be. And really that comes down to regular testing. And there's a kind of a few technical best practices as well that I'll very briefly touch on, but it's the idea that you've got more than one copy of this critical data and it's going offline and it's being taken off site to prevent from the traditional risks like fire and theft and damage to any IT infrastructure. And then there's the one things we're seeing is encrypting backups is best practice. The idea here being that a backup is a perfect copy of your establishment's data. It's compressed, it's all ready to go, and if it was breached and stolen, then those malicious actors could potentially have access to a lot of sensitive data at their fingertips. So moving on. What we have seen when things don't quite go to plan. We are aware of at least 2 reprimands by the Information Commissioner's Office to schools and multi-academic trusts, the latest one being to a school in Coventry in December last year. So they do a review of the incident, and if they believe there's sufficient evidence, they can issue things like warnings, reprimands, and even financial penalties. So in this case, there was several measures that they weren't in adherence to with the National Cyber Security guidance on things like multi-factor authentication and members of staff reusing passwords across accounts. What proved an aggravating factor in this case was the fact that had 3 former breaches all reported to the ICO, but there was some kind of breathing space given as they had made remedial work very quickly and also been able to restore from their backups. So who should decision makers turn to really? We think that knowledge of good quality free resources is key, so any decision maker can make a kind of sound, informed decision for their establishment. A bit of further reading and some kind of really good resources out there that are worth reviewing are so that's now in its 12th year. It includes 10 key details on preventing and minimizing the risk of cyber attacks, including things like user education, home and mobile working, as well as user privileges. And then we're also looking at Cyber Essentials. So Cyber Essentials is the government-backed framework and accreditation scheme. It's based on 5 key technical controls. What that does basically is it proves competency and cybersecurity best practices are being followed, and you can renew that accreditation every year. Even if establishments don't choose to go for the accreditation, they can always follow the framework as closely as they can. And then one more tool that we can discuss is a toolkit for boards. So another great resource from the National Cyber Security Centre. This is an agnostic toolkit for any type of organisation, and it's getting better understanding of cybersecurity and the risks to the board level of any organisation. And the idea being that if you get buy-in from the board, that trickles down throughout the organisation. I think really that you can have all the most secure technology, but if users kind of continue to engage with phishing emails or social engineering attacks, it can only be a matter of time before a bad actor gets in. So it's well worth being on top of these before they become a threat. And that's all. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions in the Q&A box, or feel free to reach out directly.
Thank you ever so much, Harry. So we've covered quite a lot today. I have just had one question come in, which is an interesting question with regards to what we see as issues coming up in the future. So one of the things we covered off in the Kreston report was with regards to the falling school roll. So that's something that trusts really need to be watching out for, keeping an eye on the number of pupils that are coming through the school and be planning for that in the future. So looking at whether there's some parts of the estate you could mothball or use for other purposes. When you've got teachers that are leaving, whether they actually need to be replaced with what's coming up. But also in addition to that, with the falling school roll, the Office of the National Statistics is also predicting that where we are going to see pupils is from international migration. So you also need to be probably thinking about that a little bit more and putting resources towards that's coming up. So that was one of the things that we have seen coming forward, that's coming in the future to be watching out for. I think that's it for the questions. So thank you everyone for attending today. I would encourage you can go onto our website and download the Kreston benchmarking report if you've not done so already. And I'm quite happy to have a conversation with anyone about anything we've discussed today. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us.